By way of, I guess, a bit of a reminder, I just want to sort of bring you back to maybe your GCSE studies or other biology studies in the past. And I just want to remind you that when we eat something like carbohydrate, this carbohydrate, or it could be protein, or lipids, what we refer to as fat, these are insoluble. Okay, these are insoluble. And what that means is that these cannot be actually passed into the bloodstream. They're too big. They are too, in fact, macro. But what we do is we break these nutrients down. And we do that, obviously, in the presence of enzymes. And you might be aware that lipids are also broken down in the presence of bile, for example. And we convert these into what we call soluble products. And they're soluble because they can be passed into the blood, and these are simple sugars. I'm going to call these, particularly glucose, of course, we're interested. Protein is broken down into amino acids, and lipids are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. Now, if you're unsure about that process and where that happens and the role of different enzymes and what have you, I've got whole playlists on that, and you can revisit perhaps some of my biology materials, also some of my PE materials as well, and you can perhaps go and have a look at that. Have your chat with your teacher about accessing those pre-resources. But I just wanted to make sure we've got that clear. Now we've got that sort of idea in mind, I just now want to talk specifically about macronutrients. Now, we're going to talk about 3 today. Now, I've already sort of labelled them for you, but I just want to repeat here. We are going to talk about, over here, we're going to have a look at carbohydrates and what they do when we eat and absorb them as, let's say, glucose. We are going to talk about proteins, and we're going to talk about those over here. And we are going to talk, in a few moments' time, we are going to talk about lipids or fats. Lipids. So these are in effect the 3 macronutrients I want to get some awareness of today. The only thing I just want to mention in addition to that is I am going to touch later on fiber, which we generally don't consider a macronutrient, but I am going to mention it later on as a sort of a special case for one particular reason, and you'll see why I'm going to do that later on. Now, let's go back to our carbohydrates. What are these? First of all, they are a source of energy. And in fact, folks, one of the terms I really encourage you to think about, especially with regard to exercise science, is that they are preferred by all cells. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean by preferred, James? Well, we of course have other sources of energy. We have, for example, lipids, and proteins can in fact provide some small amount of energy, but your cells prefer working with carbohydrates, and that's therefore we can call them our preferred energy source. Now, typically in the average person, and we will challenge this in other tutorials, but typically we're looking at 60 to 65% of dietary input or intake should be in the form of carbohydrates. And what happens is that we have got polymers, and these polymers are called starches. Okay, so we've got starch, again, coming back to carbohydrate, and those polymers are broken down into single sugars. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. I'm actually going to use the term simple, I wouldn't say simple, not single. Now, the reason I didn't say single there is because we actually have different kinds of sugars. You might be aware there's monosaccharides, disaccharides. I'm not going to get into that here, but a single sugar would be a monosaccharide, for example, glucose. I'm talking more generally here. We could be talking about fructose, for example, but we're talking here about simple sugars being broken down from starch. And the classic example we would use is glucose. Now, you probably already know that glucose is an energy source for both the anaerobic glycolytic system and also for the aerobic system. So that's a really important product for us. But what else about carbohydrates? Well, we get them from pasta, we get them from rice, we get them from bread, we get them from potatoes. Now, there are other examples of starches, and these are, of course, all starch. But of course, we can take on board sugars too, and we tend to get sugars from things like fruit. We tend to get sugars from things like veg, maybe milk, things like this. This is where we get our sugars from. Now, other things I want to mention to you. Absorption of these things, and of course, remember, we're talking here about our simple sugars, our soluble products. Absorption occurs occurs, as you probably know, in the small intestine. In fact, specifically, absorption begins in the duodenum of the small intestine, and of course you might have some awareness of the villi and the microvilli folds in the intestinal wall and how much surface area that applies to, for example, glucose to be able to pass into the bloodstream. And you might also know it can be done by active transport as well as passive transport. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that now. But other things we should be aware of is that glucose can be stored, okay? And the human body is capable of storing up to 2 hours worth of glucose in the form of, folks, glycogen. We can't store glucose, but we can store glycogen, which is effectively stored glucose. But if we have more than that, excess glucose, what do we do with that? Do we excrete it? Do we get rid of it? No, we convert to fat, okay, and then we store it. So just be aware of that one. Any kind of excess glucose will actually be converted to fat and stored. Now, obviously, that is coming sort of over that. Once glycogen in the liver is fully compensated and full, then obviously we're going to store any additional in the as fat, in essence. Now then, let's take things further. Let's have a look at lipids. Remind yourselves, lipids are fats. They are also an excellent source of energy, but they are not the preferred source. However, they're really good when we're working at low intensity. So as I'm making this video now, perhaps as you're watching it, it's quite likely that you're metabolizing and you're oxidizing fats because you're working at low intensity. Of course, they're storable. In fact, we'd often refer to lipids as, effectively the kind of the potential energy store of the body. And we store them under the skin. We can call this subcutaneous fat, if you would like to use that term, under the skin fat. But we also store fat around organs. And this is often to do with protection and insulation, sometimes to do with transmission. But we've got that stored around organs. Now, remind yourselves, a lipid we would expect to look a bit like this. Here's my glycerol, and off it like this are my 3 fatty acids. Now, what digestion does is it breaks this relationship here. And what we end up with is our glycerol, and we end up with 3 free fatty acids like this. So we get both glycerol and fatty acids when we break down our lipids. So I just wanted to get that point across. Again, the absorption, just like we had with glucose, it happens in the small intestine once again. But the other thing is we can oxidize lipids, well, particularly glycerol and fatty acids. We can oxidize lipids for energy, but as I said before, at low intensity. So think about someone on a light jog or a cool down or jogging back into position in, a hockey match. They may well be oxidizing fats. Now, source of these, we're talking about meat, or meat products. We're talking about oils. We're talking about some veg. And a couple of things I want to mention to you. Trans fats, which you should be aware of, are in sort of fast foods and sweet foods and this sort of thing. Trans fats and animal fats. Okay, these are the types of fats that are going to raise, that's an up arrow, cholesterol. And particularly think about plaque deposits in the blood, which will ultimately lead to an increase in blood pressure, increase in resistance, and can lead to conditions like hypertension. But this is important, folks. Our green happy fats, if we think about vegetable fats, vegetable olive oil, vegetable fats, these help to bring down cholesterol. So the balance of the type of fats we are taking on is really, really important. So there's our fats. Now, I'm going to finish off with our macronutrients, talking about proteins here for you. Now, you'll be aware of what proteins are. We pick them up in meat and nuts and pulses and this sort of thing, and fish. But remind yourselves, they are for repair, they are for growth. So therefore, they are essential when it comes to the adaptations from training, for example, adaptations from exercise. But also, guys, they can provide small amounts small amounts of energy, but this is under specific conditions. If we were in an extreme marathon, the Marathon des Sables, for example, and we've run tens and tens and tens of miles, and we've got a lack of we've got a lack of glycogen, perhaps we can't consume enough lipids quickly enough, what we might start doing is actually using the protein in the body and converting it into utilizable structures. But that is more extreme. We also find it in people in situations of starvation or eating disorders. I won't get into that kind of stuff here. Now, we are expecting it to be 10 to 15% of our intake. More importantly, folks, where it comes from, we get this from meat, we get this from fish, we get this from nuts, we get this from pulses. This is where we acquire our protein from, and we break them down into amino acids, and those amino acids, you may recall, are then delivered to the ribosomes in cells, and they're built back into human proteins. And it's one of the interesting things about protein is that we consume, let's say, protein from meat, let's say, or fish, a piece of cod, and we then break those proteins down into amino acids. We then reconstruct them, not into fish proteins, but into human proteins. That's effectively what proteins are. And what do we do with those? We take them and we make them into things such as muscle filaments. We're going to talk about that later on in this course, but muscle filaments, we will make them into hormones, we will make them into enzymes, and that is what is occurring at the ribosomes, folks. That is what that study back in the GCSE days was all about. Back at those organelles, those tiny little structures in each cell, the ribosomes there for protein synthesis. Now, before we finish this off, folks, I just want to talk, and there's lots of information there, I'm aware of that. Let me change my page. I just want to talk you through the factors affecting macronutrients. I'll just put macros, okay, which is a term we do actually use in sort of dietary consideration. And what do we mean by this? Well, we are saying that certain things are worth considering. First of all, let's talk about body composition. There's a couple of points here that will help you understand this better. So, first of all, if we struggle, if we don't replace proteins, or if protein is too low in our diet, it can lead to what we would call sarcopenic. It's meant to be a C, sorry folks. Sarcopenic obesity. Now this of course is if someone is gaining weight regardless, but sarcopenic obesity, what that means is that a person has high fat percentage and they have low muscle mass percentage. Now obviously someone could be heavy and have quite a lot of fat and quite a lot of muscle, right? Because they could, whatever, a previous athlete or something like this. And this has always been the case. This has always happened with the aged. People, as they get older, tend to find the situation if they're heavy. But what this has been sort of discovered now is it's now common in what we would call, it's common in the pediatric population. In other words, sarcopenic obesity is now common in children. Why? Because children are not gaining enough muscle mass and they're gaining too much fat because they are not eating enough protein, not doing enough exercise, and eating too many fats in their diet. So an interesting one for that one. We've already touched on this, but age, just want to take this a little bit further. With age, what we would say is that younger people, for example, you're going to find that you need at least 16% protein in your diet. And of course that makes sense, growth and development and all those sorts of things. But what we also find is that with elderly people, now I'm 47, I don't consider myself elderly by any stretch, but we might be talking something nearer 11% protein, because lower protein when we're older is associated with less mortality. We're more likely to live longer if we don't overeat protein later in our lives, and that's worth considering. A couple of other things: sex differences. Differences between men and women with regard to micronutrients. Generally speaking, men take in greater amounts of energy. So generally, more calories for men is a pretty common average. However, men are less likely, and I was surprised by this, likely to eat less likely to eat protein at the right proportion. And finally, folks, this is why I mentioned fiber before. 95% of men and women lack fiber. Now, obviously, I've only mentioned fiber once here, and that's why I mentioned it right at the start. And then finally, folks, the last factor I want to talk about today, put it into green up here. I just want to talk about activity levels. And this is where it gets kind of interesting to us from a kind of a sports science perspective. Obviously, if we're more active, we need to make adjustments. Okay, so if we've got high activity, that means we need high carbs. Okay, so more carbohydrates. Also, the timing of protein becomes important. The timing of protein becomes important. You might well know that we need to be eating protein post-training or post-performance. And you might also know that about 30 grams post-performance or post-training is really, really good for us. Now, one last point I just want to sort of make generally. When people are doing weight loss exercise programs, it's really important that those guys particularly eat protein. So if someone is doing weight loss, okay, so someone's doing exercise to do weight loss, they're probably not eating very much, and protein therefore needs to be part of that consideration, because if it's not, we can find that those people experience muscle atrophy or loss of muscle tissue. Thanks for listening.